don't think that you want to do the moth recording because you're not very confident about the moths at the moment, you don't need to, but I'm including it in this, just briefly mentioning it because it is possible. And why is it I'm promoting this type of standardized recording, the transect walks and so on? The answer is because it allows valid comparisons between sites. So you might hear people talk about a particular nature reserve and say it's absolutely brilliant for a particular thing, but they might be basing that on one visit, on one day, when for one afternoon when they were there, things were great, and the next day perhaps wasn't so good. Standardized data collected over relatively long periods allows us to make much more sensible comparisons between sites, between years, and of course the different management techniques that are used in different places, or in a single place, but comparing how long it was since the management and what's happened since it was employed. Anyway, moving on, the data that is collected in all these standardized surveys goes through to the government and even actually still to the EU. The EU still use our data because it's the best in terms of informing them about how economic policies affect our invertebrates. So they use our butterfly data for that. And in addition, I would say personally that it's so much more absorbing and rewarding to do it in a standardized way because you know how much more useful it is, therefore it feels better to do it that way. One thing that comes out of it, of course, is that people fairly often, I usually get a couple of calls each year from someone desperate to try and stop some development somewhere, and it can be that this sort of recording leads to development stopping. I'm not going to go into this individual case, but you can see that it says that a housing development could be halted. I don't know whether it was. I think mitigation was employed in this case, but we do get development stopped once we have proper records, that is standardized records showing that somewhere is very important. So standardized surveys come in three types actually. We're going to concentrate on the first two, the transect walk, which is also known, but by hardly anyone these days. When it first started, it was also called the pollard walk. I think that name's gone out. And the wider countryside butterfly survey, those two we're concentrating on. I will mention the single species reduced effort survey as well. So, whichever of these standardized surveys you're doing, what are you going to need? You can read the screen as easily as I can read it to you, but I will mention that you do need some sort of thermometer. Some people tell me that they just look at the weather forecast before they set off. Well, I'm not sure that's sufficient. In my opinion, you shouldn't try to get a feeling for the temperature on a day by looking at the weather forecast, which is predicting the maximum temperature that you will get that day, and who knows whether you were there when it was at that maximum temperature, and who knows whether they were accurate in their prediction, because remember, it is a prediction of the temperature. So you should take a thermometer with you, and I've put in car just here because most people do have a thermometer in their car these days. But remember that usually your car is giving you a slightly false reading because you're driving along a black road. If the sun is shining, then the road surface heats up quickly and the car will give you a slightly higher temperature than is actually the fact in the shade, because, very important, you only need to know the shade temperature. That's all we're interested in recording, the shade temperature. So it might be 40 degrees in the sun, but as long as it isn't 40 degrees in the shade, then it's still safe to carry on. And it's no good, by the way, equally, saying, well, my car said it was 13, so it's okay to do a walk if your car was in the sun on a black road, because 13 there may well translate to 11 in the shade. Suitable clothing, and then these various optional bits. For those of you that may prefer this in a visual way, we have the visual bit here. Now you'll notice I've got a map at the top, and that's because although obviously taking a phone with you is an incredibly good idea, especially if you're on your own, you can't guarantee having signal, and unless you know the site, obviously you will if you've walked it several times before, but unless you know the site, it might be an idea to have a map just in case you get lost. Because if you can't get a signal, then you can't use Google Maps or any other method to find your way out. Binoculars can be useful for looking at butterflies at the tops of trees or slightly further away, but usually If they're that far away, then they're outside the area that you're supposed to be recording in. A net is very useful for those tricky species like the small and the Essex skipper and all the whites, but you're not really supposed to use it while you're walking the transect. I'll come back to that later. I put spectacles here because if you're like me, you need to wear glasses for reading, which means if I catch any of the smaller moths and even some of the smaller butterflies, I sometimes need to put my glasses on to see them properly. So don't forget your glasses. Even if they are reading glasses, you might want them. And the other bits are pretty much the same as we saw before. This, by the way, isn't so that you can decorate the route. This is supposed to be to remind you that you might want to take an ID guide to some of the routes that you're going to find along your walk and with which you're least familiar. Okay. So the transect recording method, which is administered by the UK BMS, is all the details about it are on this website, and I'm not going to go into what's here because there is masses and masses of stuff. You can see that there's one submenu called methods, and that gives you loads and loads of different information about different ways to do different things. Again, I'm not going into that. If you want to explore all that on your own, brilliant. I would suggest that is a good thing. Read the bits that are going to apply to you, but I'm not going through that now. I'm going to go through the basic method. So on there, the bit you really want to be interested in reading, the bit I would advise you perhaps to print off and take with you the first few times you go out, are the rules, the guide to how to do it. And the wider countryside butterfly scheme, which is based on the BTO's breeding bird survey, is exactly the same in most of its method as the transect route. So the only difference really is down to the number of visits that you make and when you make them. There are a few other minor differences, but mostly the two are the same. Very little difference between them. And not surprisingly, the wider countryside guidance is pretty extensive too. It's at the same website, the UK BMS. You can find it through Butterfly Conservation's pages if you want. So there's all the stuff you need there, including landowner letter. I'll perhaps mention that if I remember later. So loads of stuff on the website. But remember, if you are thinking about downloading masses of stuff to take with you to add into your bottle of water and a snack in case you get hungry, plus waterproofs, plus sunscreen, plus blah, blah, blah. You're supposed to go out and enjoy these things, and you really don't want, on some of our steeper slopes, to be carrying massive equipment, especially on a hot summer's day. So try and pare down what you take with you to the stuff you really need, and don't take too much because it turns into a slog and not an enjoyable experience. So what we're going to be doing in our training session is using one of these forms and having a go at filling it in, but we won't obviously be seeing any butterflies. It's too early in the season, but we will see some pretend butterflies. I want to draw to your attention what you are asked to record, and the fact that some of this needs to be looked into before you set off. So perhaps even before you leave home. Obviously the recorder bit, that's the recorder's name. The grid ref you will know because the wider countryside butterfly survey people will have given you that information. Start time you'll be able to work out, and finish time you'll be able to work out when you're actually on site. Date's pretty obvious, the county that you're recording in is pretty obvious, but the average temperature, if it isn't going to be above 13, if it's not above 13, then you shouldn't go. Unless, and we'll come back to this, the weather is truly dreadful for several weeks. The wind direction is important because some butterflies are prepared to fly in a fairly strong southerly wind, because it's generally warmer then, than they are in a fairly strong northerly wind, because remember, a lot of these butterflies will have deliberately gone to bed, so to speak, I don't think that's a technical term for it, in the shade. They are almost always going to roost somewhere which is in the shade early in the morning. So it requires them to get quite warm before they fly out of that shady position, and a strong northerly wind will prevent that. even if the temperature out in the sun is warm enough for butterflies to fly around and move around, if they're in the shade with a strong cold wind blowing across them, they won't bother. Average wind speed, you can see there's some tiny text there. When you get one of these forms, I'll be giving them out on Saturday, or you can print your own if you're not coming along on Saturday. Then you can see this and interpret it. It's good, I think, that they do print this on here. In the past, it used just to say average wind speed, and there was no way of checking this unless you took that along with you separately. And then finally, in this bit here, all of you are going to put no, because there's nothing in the Upper Thames area. Well, I suppose I shouldn't say that. Somebody might be listening in from Scotland, but there's nowhere in the Upper Thames area which is upland. Now, here's a really important point. The amount of sunshine in the sections. You have got to notice. It's not much good, and this does definitely happen. It's happened to several people that I've spoken with, that they've done this. Maybe the first few times they go out for a walk, they're so concentrated on making sure they identify their species correctly and count them accurately. They get to the end of the walk, and then they see this bit and say a very rude word, because they just cannot remember. They know it wasn't 100% sunshine all the way, but how much was it in each section? And that is important. So try to get into the habit, after you finish each section, before you start the next one, write down how much sunshine there was. And perhaps this is a good time to go into how you can tell. You judge the sunshine, whether you're in the shade or not, by whether there are shadows. So at any time that there is a shadow, and if you are in the shade, you've got to look into the distance in some direction to a bit where the sun could be seen if it was shining, to see if there's shadows. If there is a shadow, then it is 100% sunny. That makes sense? If the sun is strong enough to give a shadow, even a weak shadow, then it's sunny. If you can't discern shadows, if there's no way of telling whether anything is casting a shadow because everything is at the same illumination, then it's not sunny. And you just have to make an estimate in your own mind of whether it was only 10% of the time, 20% of the time, 30%, and so on, because it's in 10% guesstimates of how long the sun was out while you were walking that section. And I think what you do on this bit of the form is pretty obvious. You just put down the number that you've seen. So if in section 1 I see 1 orange tip, I put 1, and if in section 2 I don't see any, I leave it empty or put 0. And in section 3 I might see 3, and so on.
Sorry, Nick.
So, yeah.
Can I just ask you to start again with the recording form, because we had a few latecomers, which is entirely my administration fault. So
I doubt that, Carla, because you're a good administrator, but I will start again. I'll go back a couple.
No, well, just to talk about the form really, because we're recording it, so I can send it out afterwards. But I think just to stress about the sunshine and the time bit, okay. I did get my head confused around that bit, but right. Sorry, I'm sure everyone else has got it. It was just me. Thank you. I'll shut up.
Okay, right. Just to briefly say, if people didn't hear this bit, that the wider countryside butterfly survey and the transect surveys follow pretty much the same methodology, and the recording sheets look very similar. I will be putting the transect sheet up in a minute so you can see the difference. The things which you have to fill in, and some of them I suggested think about before you set off. The one that's most important is average temperature. It must be above 13. It must be an average above 13, and that's the shade temperature, not in the sun, not in some specially warm bit of your route, the average temperature. So if the wind is very cold, it could be that you don't, even though you can record temperatures above 13 in some sections where it's sunny and sheltered, remember it's got to be the average. So you might say, I'm not even bothering to go today because the forecast says it won't get above 12, and I've just been outside and in my own garden it's only 11, so there doesn't seem very much point. Start time and finish time, we'll come back to those. They're a bit important to think about before you set off as well, but we'll come back to those. And I've been through the fact that many people, when they first start doing this, they're so fixated on making sure they spot all the butterflies within their little box. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute. The box you're walking in, the imaginary box you're walking in, that they forget, whilst identifying these and accurately counting them, they forget that they've also got to note the amount of sunshine. So you need to get into the habit, while you're walking along looking at butterflies, also look to see, have you got a shadow? Is there any shadow anywhere around you? If you're in the shade of a tree as you walk along, then obviously you won't be able to see your own shadow, but can you see the shadow of the tree a bit further ahead or behind you? If at any time you can see a shadow, however hazy, that's sunny. At the end of the section, you make a guesstimate of how many percentages of time the sun was out, not how strong it was, but how long it was out. So if you think it was only out for 20% of the time, you put 20. If you think it was out almost all the time, but not quite all, 90, 80, you've got to judge. It's a guesstimate. It's not supposed to be scientifically accurate, but it gives a very good clue to those who look at the data later as to what the conditions were like. And you do that at the end of each section, not the end of the walk, the end of each section, please. Now the transect form, this is the transect form, as you can see across the top, is really similar. One difference, instead of asking you for a grid reference, they ask for the site name. This is because when the Transect weekly field recording form was first devised, they gave every site a unique name, and you have to put the right name in there, the one that this Transect has been allocated. When they started the WCBS, they did it with a randomized selection of grid squares, so they used the grid reference, but otherwise these are recording pretty much the same thing. Recorder's name, the year's a bit daft really, I think there's the date, same thing, isn't it? Week number, don't need to fill that in, don't worry about it, but if you want to, you can put down when you start on the 1st of April, it's week 1 and so on. Start and finish times, average temperature, same rules apply. Shouldn't go out below 13, but I will talk about that later. Average wind speed, and here's the same scale to make your judgment, and wind direction. Now, for those of you who are observant and were listening to me, which I'm hoping is 100% of you, I'm sure you're all listening attentively, but did you notice there was something I made a big stress about, which isn't on this form? Where's the sunshine gone? Well, bizarrely, on the butterfly transect form, they put it at the bottom of the page. So here it is on the wider countryside at the top. Average temperature, we just went through that. Wind direction, yeah, come on, I'm trying to get to something else. Sunshine at the top on the wider countryside, but it's at the bottom, look, of the transect form. Now, please don't ask me why. I can't explain it. There's no sensible reason for it, is there? It's just that obviously a different person designed the forms. I think it's better with the sunshine at the top, and if you print these for yourself, there's no reason why you couldn't jiggle it about and put it at the top. But anyway, there we are. The sunshine's at the bottom on some forms, but you need to record it separately for each section. Now, the actual walks themselves, the physical walks and the mapping of the walks. There is a difference between the UK BMS Transect walk and the wider countryside scheme walks, because transect walks can be anywhere that you like. If you think that the route you take to go out in the morning and buy a newspaper or a croissant or a coffee, whatever it is good, then you can use that. If you think the route you take to go to work, if you think the route that you take for a walk at lunchtime, anywhere, if it's where you go to your favourite nature reserve, that could be it. Most people for a transect walk have chosen a spot they like where they see lots of butterflies, and they've split their transect up into sections based on habitat. So number 1 is along this main track, which is probably, I'm guessing, quite a wide track, and then they veer off. Now, whether this is a footpath, I don't know, because it looks like there is a path there, doesn't it? So this could be a footpath in a really open area. And then they go through this bit, God knows what that is, it looks like a lake on this map. I've no idea where Calendar Wood is, so I don't know what this represents, but this is obviously a different sort of habitat, and that's the point. On a transect walk, each of the sections should be marked by something obvious and semi-permanent that you will be able to find it again next year. So this might be a finger post pointing to a footpath, or it might be a gate, a stile. Here the same. You can see we're coming out of some woodland, or an open woodland from the look of it, into a much more open area. That's the point where you start the new transect. And then you go back in again, and that section finishes. Quite why there's a little zigzag there, I don't know, but it might be there's a stream. So it's alongside the stream is a new section, and then it's off into the wood again. I don't know why there's a difference between 5 and 6, but the person who started this transect will have a reason. So it may be that 5 and 6 get different management. It doesn't really matter. The point is, in a transect walk, each of the sections is between permanent or semi-permanent marking spots, things that you can easily see, so that should you say next year, I can't go certain weeks, will somebody do it for me? That person can make out very easily where the sections are. And the sections are planned to try and take in all the different habitats that are available at this site. Each section should be continuous, similar habitat, not different habitats in one section and then a whole load of trying to work out whether you saw more, let's say, purple emperors in one bit than another because of the habitat when they're all jumbled up. So you try and keep separate habitats to give you a clue. And as I say, you can put a transect walk anywhere you like in the UK with the landowner's permission. You might remember there was a landowner's letter. I said I'd come back to that. I'm afraid the UK BMS people, and equally me, are very unlikely to know who the landowner is for any site. If it's one local to me, there's a possibility I will, but I'm not guaranteeing it. So there's a letter which you can print off and take to a landowner once you've managed to work out who that is and say, this is an official scheme. I'm not doing it because I'm some sort of maverick person doing these things all on my own. The information is used centrally, and it might be that the official letter carries a bit of weight to help you get permission to walk.
Sorry, Nick, I have a question about the transect sections. Are there any constraints on the section length? Off the top of my head, I don't think so, but I'll let you.
I agree with you, Carla, but I would say, and I will say it, I think it's actually in my text a bit later, if you make the whole walk more than 1 hour long, you will regret it in the summer. Because in the summer, if you make the walk an hour long in the spring, which is when people tend to set them up, you'll regret it in the summer, because when you're trying to sort all the skippers, all the different browns, all the whites, and keep an eye out for the hair streaks above your head, etc., 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 and it's really hot, then it starts to become onerous. And that's
Thanks,
the last
Nick.
thing.
Don't put them off too much.
Yep. So be relatively conservative in including extra bits and pieces into your transect walk. If you're setting up a brand new one, try and get all the habitats at that site in the least distance possible. Makes it easier to walk. Okay, so when? This is a difference between transect walks and the wider countryside scheme. The transect walks begin on the 1st of April, but you can start earlier if you wish. I don't think many people will have started this week. And they go on until the 30th of September. Again, if you want, you can go on longer. But the official time and the times between which you must attempt to do the walk, it might be you're part of a team, so it isn't you individually, but someone in your team must walk every week from the 1st of April till the 30th of September. And if some people are really keen and the weather's wonderful, you can do extras either side. The time of day is not before 10:45 and not after 3:45 for virtually the whole year. You'll see it says you can go earlier and stay later in perfect conditions, which means temperatures above 21, still air, that sort of thing. If the conditions are really good, you can go a bit earlier so you don't cook in the heat of the day, and you can stay a bit later if you couldn't get there in the morning, or if you want to walk one transect somewhere in the morning and then do a different one in the afternoon. You can do that if the weather is perfect. All that, what makes a perfect conditions is in those long lists of things that I mentioned at the beginning that you can print off and read if you want. Anyway, you shouldn't even start at 10:45 if it's still below 13 degrees C. You can certainly go to the site and hang about until it does get to be 13 degrees C, but you shouldn't walk if the weather isn't suitable for butterfly activity. I think that's sort of obvious, isn't it, really? Because there's no point walking around and recording nothing, as you would have done today, I think, in most of Britain. So you can see why there's just no point. It doesn't record anything useful. It just wastes your time and gets you cold and wet. So please try and stick with this. Don't go out too early. Don't stay too late. It messes up all your day because you've got the whole of the middle taken out doing your transect. That's one reason I say make them short. Because if you've got a 2-hour transect to walk and you don't start till 11, by the time you finish it at 1 o'clock and you've had some dinner, that's most of your day gone, isn't it?
Sorry, Nick, can I interrupt another question?
Yep.
I've got, is it like the bird watch where you count the maximum number as you see at any one time, or is it where you count each butterfly you see?
Well, we're coming to that. So,
we are, aren't we?
Yep, that's coming up. Remind me if I forget, but I don't think I will.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now the wider countryside, as I say, this is a difference. You must walk at least once in July and once in August, 10 days apart. I would say it's much better, rather than just going once in July and once in August, to go in early July, late July and August. But the scheme allows, it calls it a valid effort if you've just been out twice, once in July and once in August, provided they're 10 days apart, these visits. But it's definitely better. You will get better data if you go early July, late July and August. And I can hear some of you thinking, well, what about things like Orange Tip? What about things like Dingy Skipper? So obviously it would be better still if you could go out up to 5 times with a walk in May, a walk in June, a walk in early July, late July and August. But you don't have to go early on, because it's the things that are seen in midsummer that tend to be seen most often on the wider countryside butterfly survey walks. Remember, these are squares chosen at random, so they don't, in fact very rarely do they have any very rare species. They're not likely to have a species that is going to fly around in large numbers in the spring, apart possibly from brimstone, but you're going to see that anyway in August. So you don't need to walk them, but I would say best practice is that you do walk them in May, June, twice in July and once in August. But even just going once in July and once in August is enough to satisfy the requirements. Oops, sorry, I meant to go down to page rather than to the next page. So as for transects, you've got the same times here. Look, only when the weather is suitable. We just went through that. There's no point going if you're not going to see anything, fairly obviously. Again, I haven't put it on here, but again, if it's absolutely glorious weather and you want to start a bit earlier because you know it's going to be 30 something degrees at lunchtime, then you can go at 10, and you could finish at 5 o'clock in the evening. So what constitutes this weather that's decent? So you need at least 60% sun, at least 60% sun. So you should have a shadow 60% of the total time when it's above 13, if it isn't over 17. So in this temperature range, you need a lot of sun, more than half the time. And that's for both types of walk. For both types of walk, if it's above 17, you can walk around whether it's sunny or not. Doesn't make any difference to the scheme. I can tell you now that if you walk around at exactly 17 and it's cloudy, you'll see a lot less than if you wait for it to get a bit warmer. So if it's possible, don't go out when it's only just 17 because it doesn't work very well. It might do in some parts of Britain, but round here at about 17 degrees C in the cloud, you don't see very much. You will see something, but you don't see very much. And this says, this bit here, providing it isn't raining, that applies to all of these, of course. You shouldn't really walk in the rain because most of the insects we're looking for will just settle out of sight to try and keep out of the rain, so you won't see them. So we've looked out the window, we can see that it looks from the sky that it's going to be mostly sunny, more than 60%. The temperature that day is predicted to be 16, and we've checked outside, it's 12 now, and we know that by the time we've driven to wherever we're going to walk, it'll be a little bit warmer, so we're ready to go. The only thing we haven't thought about then is the wind speed. You don't go if it's stronger than 5. Now, I did give you the heads up that on your recording form, it just explains the wind speeds. They begin with the lightest winds at 0, and they go all the way up to 12. If it's above 5, you shouldn't walk. So you can walk at 5, which is when trees are starting to blow about quite noticeably. You can see them swaying around in the wind. But above that, you know, when it looks like branches might get broken off or something, you definitely shouldn't be out there. If it gets anywhere near difficult to hold a piece of paper and write on it because the wind is so strong, that's too strong. And what do we mean by walking a transect and WCBS walk? Well, we mean going at a steady pace. And I've put through each section, I think I perhaps ought to put, and each season. Because please remember, when you're walking around in the spring, that, you know, you're walking around, you might go around the entire route and see one butterfly, a single peacock, let's say. In the summer, you could well be seeing, and I'm not joking, hundreds of butterflies in just one section. So obviously you'll be going more slowly because you've got to keep writing them down because you can't remember what you've seen. That means it's really important that in the spring, to make this a standardized method, you walk more slowly than you feel is necessary. Because in the summer, even if you try to walk quickly, you won't be able to because you'll miss things. The next bit does start with the words, if possible. You're walking along at this steady pace, and in the spring, it'll be no trouble at all to write down what you've seen in a section at the end of the section, because you won't see all that much. In the summer, you probably will need to stop. You should try not to. If you've got a very good memory and you can remember how many you've seen of each different species, you know, there might be 12 species along your section, then write them down at the end of the section. At the same time, you write down the percentage of time the sun was shining. But what you'll probably need to do is to make some sort of note as you go along through the section, or you'll forget how many meadow browns, large skippers, speckled woods you saw, because there'll be too many for you to remember. Too many for me to remember, perhaps I should say. And this is a good point where I can bring up about how do you know what to record? Is it like the bird survey? No, it's not. We're going to see in a moment that you're walking along inside a box and you record everything you see in that box, apart from butterflies that came from behind you. So it's the maximum within that box are written down, and then you move on into the next box, as it were, and you write them all down again. Some of them might be the same butterfly, but the fact that you're not recording things from behind you will reduce that. We'll deal with that in a minute. That always causes trouble. People always want to ask me questions about that. We'll get to that in a minute. Transects have no limit to their size, and there's no limit to the number of sections. So what Carla said just a minute ago, she was quite right. But I would say it isn't sensible to make it too big. It just gets to become really difficult for you as a recorder. And when one day you say to somebody, would you like to do this for me while I go on holiday? You'll find people are really reluctant to walk a transect that takes 2 hours and records 1,500 butterflies. It's just hard work. The WCBS section always has the The wider countryside butterfly survey always has 10 sections. And all of them, every single one of those sections is 200 meters long. They run in 2 parallel lines. So you walk away from the beginning for 5 of your 200-meter long sections. Then you turn round and you come back on a different route for 2 further groups of 5. So it makes a kilometre walking away and a kilometre walking back towards the start. So that's a big difference between transects, which are completely formless. It's down to you to decide, and WCBS, where it's all decided for you, and it has to be like that. Just put this little bit at the bottom because people do ask me this question. I personally don't think you should walk with another person who might talk to you and say things like, "Didn't you see that swallowtail that just went past?" Because it tends to distract you. And then you've got the issue of, do I record that or not? It was there because they saw it, but I'm supposed to be recording what I saw. I think if they said to you, "I think you missed a meadow brown," among those 79 meadow browns you did record, you'd think, oh, well, one more doesn't make much difference. But if they did say, "Didn't you see that swallowtail?" you'd be tempted to add it. Should you? Well, my feeling is it's best to walk alone. If you're going to walk with another person, explain to them at the beginning that you'd rather they didn't help you out by telling you what they can see, because it's down to you to record what you can see. If they want to produce a separate record and you can check the 2 at the end to see if they're similar, that's okay, but you're recording it and they shouldn't be helping you or distracting you. Okay, you can arrange a transect walk anywhere you want, as long as you've got permission. We did that bit. I would say don't take a transect walk, don't make a transect walk, and don't take on a transect walk that takes you more than an hour to walk around very slowly. If you're setting one up from new, make sure the transition points between each section is really clear. There's no point saying to people, well, when this was set up, there used to be a tree there, but they've cut it down and cleared it away, so now it's a bit tricky. You have to guess where the tree was. That's obviously not good, is it? So try and find good places to make the transitions between sections. And my advice, if you've got a large site, if you've got a site where it's obviously going to take more than an hour to walk around it, then perhaps you can set up 2 completely separate transects rather than one very long transect. And as I said, I would suggest to you that you keep your section lengths short. Otherwise, you find you've got a long section, and the day that you set up your transect, it was all being managed in exactly the same way. But 3 years in, they do some cutting in one part of it and not the rest, and now you've got a confusion, because you can see that the management has changed the butterflies you're seeing, but it doesn't show up in what you've recorded, because you've recorded 2 or 3 different habitats now within one section. So keep the section length short too. Whereabouts are the WCBS walks? Well, they're allocated randomly. So we personally, as a branch, and you as an individual, you can't get in touch with BC and say, "Can I have a WCBS walk near my village, please?" No, they don't do it like that. But this map gives you an idea of where the ones are which have been allocated to our region. I'll leave you to look at that for a minute. Most of these are actually allocated already. So it might be you look at this one here near Abingdon and think, oh, I wouldn't mind doing that because I live over here somewhere and that's really close. But it may be gone. We're going to come on to the next slide, which shows which ones are still available. No, we're not. We're going to come on to the next slide that shows what the wider countryside butterfly survey routes look like. So this box is idealized in a world where they had chosen a random square and they picked one which had, for some reason, a bridle way going for a kilometre in this direction, and then a footpath coming back in this direction. This is the ideal world, and that would be absolutely perfect. These 2 are 500 metres apart, look, and each section 200 metres long fits perfectly into this 1 kilometre square. But when they actually do it for real and send you a random square, you look at it and you think, oh my God, there's a river through it. Well, maybe that's a beach and this is a sea or a lake. Can't do it because I can't walk a kilometre down there or drown. Or it's like this, where you've got a walk that goes across a very busy road, or possibly that's a railway, which again makes it difficult. So all sorts of slight bends and twists, and even bits of the route being slightly outside the square are permissible, so that you can get your 2 1 kilometre walks in. It all depends on the actual square you're given, but it's very, very rare that you find something even as perfect as this one here, where there are 2 routes which run roughly parallel. That is very unusual, actually. Sometimes if you've got a very friendly farmer, landowner, they will let you walk a hedge line and you can get something like this, but more often you'll find there's a footpath which goes one way absolutely perfectly, but then to get way up here somewhere before you can come back, and that the other path just cuts the corner. So we always have a negotiation about how we're going to walk this square. I think it's pretty obvious that sometimes squares will be allocated that make this quite difficult. And this just says that I took this from the information you're given. You can read it there in more detail. Sometimes you can't do a square, it's completely impossible, in which case, once it's been identified as totally impossible, the people at BC will give you a different square close to the one that's impossible. If you've got a bit of an intrusion into an adjacent square, that's absolutely fine. If there's a bit of your square that isn't possible to walk, but you can make the 2 1 kilometre walks by just going into the next square slightly, fine, as long as it's recorded accurately. And this last bit down here, obviously very sensible, although you don't need to walk any more than twice a year. I would say you should, but even though you don't need to, it's definitely a good idea to go out in April or early May and walk your 2 1 kilometre long walk bits within your square, so that you get used to the route and make sure you know where the sections begin and end. There's no reason why you can't mark them, assuming the landowner doesn't mind, with something appropriate. Not road cones that you've stolen from the local roadworks, but some way of marking out the section ends and beginnings. Because they're every 200 metres approximately, so it's not going to be necessarily a really obvious thing that you could say this is the spot, this is the gate where I walk to. So with transects, it's easier to get section ends at places which are easy to recognise and remember. So you might need to mark with some dye on the ground or tying something into the hedge, whatever it is, to remind you where your sections are. And that's why you want to go out first before you try and record. And then this last bit, if you feel a square covers an area in which you might be threatened, then don't do it. So it might be you walk it for a few years and it's fine, and then somebody, for some reason, moves into the area and starts to be a threat, or walks a dog that's very aggressive where you're walking, or something else happens, who knows, building site next door with all sorts of materials coming over into your walk. So if you ever feel that your square is not safe, that's another reason to say, please, can I have a different square? Now, this is the bit that I hope everybody's going to find simple, because it isn't all that difficult, but somehow I think these pictures don't help. They're the best I can manage. You are to record every single butterfly that you see within this imaginary box. So you're walking along towards the bottom of the screen here, and anything that you can see up to 5 meters ahead of you, and anything you can see 2.5 meters either side of you, and 5 meters above, which is a tricky ask, isn't it? You've got to look 5 meters in front, 2.5 meters either side, and 5 meters above, and walk and count and try and remember all this. So that's another good reason for going very slowly. That box is your recording box. So if you see, let's say, a small copper just here inside your box, great. And you perhaps tick that off on your sheet and walk forward through a cloud of marbled whites, and then suddenly there's another small copper, and you think, well, it might be the one I just saw. If you saw the small copper that was just in front of you hop in front a few meters, then you don't count it because you know you've just counted it. But if you didn't see it do that, you do count it. So if you've got very good reason to think that any butterfly is one you've just counted, don't count it again. But if there's no way that you can tell, you do count it. And if it's in this box, it gets counted. If it's even a few centimeters outside, you do not count it. So it might be the rarest butterfly you see all day, and it's 2.6 meters to the left. No, sorry, doesn't count. Only what's inside the box. That's what makes it a standardized thing, and that's why walking at a slow, steady pace, roughly the same pace as everyone else on your team, which you'll know because you'll be able to say to them how long does it take to walk round, that's what's so important. Because then we all get pretty much the same sort of answers, even if 3 different people walk that transect on the same day. They should all count roughly the same number of everything. The WCBS, I've changed it, look, is exactly the same. 5 meters above, 5 meters ahead, 2.5 meters either side. Now it might be that your WCBS is a footpath with a hedge on one side. It might be that your transect walk is like that too, in which case if you want, you can do 5 meters to one side. So 5 meters above, 5 meters ahead, and let's say 5 meters to your right. Or you could do 3 meters to the right and 2 meters to the left, but the total must be 5 meters. So in every dimension, you're recording across 5 meters. Only count butterflies within this imaginary box that you can identify 100% certain. That means, as an absolute fact, you're going to under-record the whites. I would estimate 60 to 70% of the white butterflies that you will see will fly past without you knowing what they were. The people who organise the scheme are aware of that. They're not happy about it, but there's nothing that can be done. You just have to let it go. You don't even write down that it was a white, just nothing. You didn't identify it. We don't know what it was. We don't put anything down. In an effort to stop double counting, never count a butterfly that flies from behind you. Now, people are going to start shouting, well, what if you've not seen one all walk? What if that's the only red admiral you see all day and it comes from behind you? The rule says never count a butterfly that flies from behind you. You don't put it in to your transect data. So it doesn't matter if it's the only one and you couldn't possibly have seen it before, you don't count it. It's a rule, and it works statistically better that way. Difficult species. That means things like the whites, but more often, in fact, it's going to be things like the skippers. It's suggested that when you get to the end of the walk, perhaps the end of a section, you might have seen a few things that you couldn't tell what they were. This is where your net comes in handy, because you can catch a few, you can wander back into your section, catch a few to see what they are. So if you caught 5 skippers and there was 1 large, 3 small and 2 Essex, you could use that to estimate what numbers you'd seen while you were walking the section and not trying to identify them down to that level. So you'd have to have made a note of roughly what you saw as you were going through, but it's really only the skippers where that's going to be a factor, I think, or possibly some of the female browns, the female blues, which are brown. They could be difficult too. It depends what the populations of butterflies are where you're walking. There's not many people who are going to have the trouble of Adonis and chalk-hill blue females, which are difficult to separate. Common blue and brown argus should be pretty easy, especially if you've got a pair of binoculars, because you can look to see whether there are black veins going through the white edge. So that doesn't take more than a few seconds to tell them apart and then move on. Coming back to this bit about single recorders provide the most reliable data, but most transects are actually walked by a small team, and I don't mean the whole team go out every day. I mean that a single recorder walks, but the next week in the transect calendar, it might be a different recorder, so that people don't get fed up with never being able to go away, and they don't get their wives moaning they never take them on holiday, do they?
Don't they?
Oh, apparently they do. Right. Sunshine estimated per section, 10% increments. If you can see your shadow, it's sunny. We did all that, didn't we? Temperature in the shade. Usually make a note at the walk's end, but make sure that it's above 13 before you start. And the wind speed, the maximum on any part. Now, I say that, and that's the rule, but obviously if there's one tiny section that you walk where it's very strong compared with all the rest of it, then maybe you could use a bit of discretion there, but it's best not to use too much discretion with these things, or it ends up not being standardized. Issues with collecting data. I am going to stop in a bit to see if there's any questions, Carla, in case you're wondering, but I'll just plough through this bit because this is fairly technical, and if I go through it quickly, it's better.
No questions at the moment.
Hooray! I'm rabbiting on so quickly, no one's got time to think. Due to the vagaries of the British weather, in other words, the fact that the weather in Britain in the summer is not at all predictable, not many people get a full set of 26 counts. There are some weeks when it's just too poor. Doesn't matter. If you miss a week, no problem at all. A small number of missing values can be automatically estimated. There's an algorithm, they call it. So you send your data in and the computer works out what you would have seen had the weather been better. However, if consecutive weeks are going to fall below these criteria, if you don't walk several times and miss 3 weeks at any point in the year, if you miss 3 weeks in a row, then that can mess up the entire thing. So if you've already missed a week and the next week, the second week after the one you've missed, is still poor, it's better to walk it, even if it may be just below the minimum, because the software can use data based on you recording the temperature accurately or the wind speed accurately to see what might have been there if the weather had been better. Hope that makes sense. So I'm just going to say that again because it is important. You're not supposed to walk if the weather is below the minimum threshold. But if you've already missed a week and the next week comes around and it isn't any better, it probably is a good idea to go out and walk, but make sure you accurately record that the weather was pants, that something was wrong with it. It was too cold, it was too cloudy, it was too windy, because the computer can take all that into account. So you don't want to have 3 weeks with no data consecutive, or 3 weeks in one 4-week period with no data, because the computer might throw its hands up and say, I'm sorry, I can't cope with that. That's too much of a hole in the data. But you shouldn't walk if the weather is poor. You have to hope that every other week is decent in the spring. And if it isn't, I'm afraid you do need to walk, but make sure you record very clearly what the weather is like. Which brings me to a bit of advice, which I would say, because of the fact that this minimum temperature of 13 is so important, and in May there are so many days when the minimum temperature doesn't quite get to 13, or April too, but it seems particularly to affect May. I'm not sure why. You get day after day when it's only 12. You've got to go out really, because otherwise you'll end up with no data. And it's best to go out and walk if it's very close to the minimum, if you missed the previous week. If it suddenly turns out a lot better later in the transect week, you could walk it a second time and discard the first lot of information. But that's something you'll pick up as you go through. Sometimes you just got to say to yourself, I don't think the conditions are really right, but I missed last week because the weather was definitely awful. So I'm going to walk this one and make very clear in my records that the weather was suboptimal, and the computer will note that and make allowances. So you might end up with this is the recording sheet that you will see in the computer once you put all your data in. So you've walked off, you've recorded, you've added all this data, you've logged into the website. Oh, find me a wood. I wonder, that's obviously an Upper Thames branch thing. I wonder whose data this was. Anyway, here we are. They've been out, started on the 1st of April, and they've been out till the 29th of September. They didn't walk the very last week, or perhaps they did, yes they did, but they didn't see very much. 1, 2 butterflies, but that's, you know, not surprising. They've got some weeks where there are complete gaps, but they've never got 3 gaps all that close together. And they've got figures here, which are the real totals that they saw of each of the species. Now the computer will take these real numbers and it will fill in the gaps for them based on what they saw in the weeks when they were able to get out. So the red numbers look at where the computer, the algorithm, has completed the data set by adding in some extra numbers. And now that was the original total. It produces a new estimate total. And some things go up a lot, look, 29 to 44. And some things stay very low because you can't really estimate that there's going to be more of them. It was the only one seen. Here, though, for some reason, I don't know what the species was, they've decided there probably were more than one. It's based on what was seen in this wood in previous years, I should think. So some numbers change quite remarkably and some don't change much at all. But this is all proven. I can't go through the statistics with you that they used to do this, but it's all been proven to be accurate because they deliberately removed some data from some record sets and let the computer recalculate, and it comes up with figures incredibly close to what's real life. So if you have to miss a few weeks, don't worry, but try never to miss 3 weeks in a row, which means the second bad week, it's always a good idea to get out because the next week might be even worse. Okay, so Transect and WCBS, what's the same? The answer is most things. You walk a fixed route and you go at a slow, steady speed. You identify every butterfly that you see, you count it, you list it inside a 5-meter square box. Only count those you identify for certain and don't count the ones that fly from behind you. I've not written that in there, but that's true for both schemes. You only count in appropriate weather conditions, we just went through all that, and at the right time, unless it's very warm. Make sure you record the weather conditions, including the percentage of sun. And when you've got all that data, register yourself with the UK BMS website and upload the records. So those are the things which these two schemes share. And that's most of it, really. Here's the differences. The Transect has a minimum number of 26 walks, and the WCBS has a minimum number of 2. When? Well, the Transect walk asks you to start on the 1st of April and finish on the 29th of September. You can do more if you want. And the WCBS says you must walk in July and August, but they would prefer that you also go in May, June, and July twice, or something similar to give you a flavour of the butterflies at different times of the year as well. What about where it's sighted and what the length of it is? Well, a transect is literally open to anything you want to suggest. I don't know that they've ever turned down anyone's request for can I put a transect here? They might have done if it was somewhere they considered too dangerous for a person to be out walking, but that would be the only stipulation, I think. You can go anywhere you want, make it any length you want, but my suggestion is think about the summer, keep it short. And then the WCBS, all the sites are allocated centrally using a random computer system that randomizes the selections. And each walk is 2 kilometres long. I'll stop there and just dare to ask, has anyone come up with any questions yet? Or are there so many things to remember that they've forgotten what they were going to ask about?
I'm just looking through the question. What was the one about going back to, is it like birdwatch where you count the maximum number you see at any one time? Or is it where you count each butterfly you see and it's the total you see in that section? So I think that's, you've answered that one really, haven't you? About
I have really. You count everything, yeah. unless you think you already counted it and it's moved without you noticing, so it's reappeared in front of you. You count everything you see.
I don't know much about the bird watch, so I
can see what they mean. I mean, that you're not supposed to, if you see 3 long-tailed tits fly past and then a bit later you see 2 long-tailed tits fly past, you assume that those 2 are part of the 3 that went past earlier. So you only count the maximum number you've seen, which would be 3 in that case, but that isn't the same for the butterflies. If 2 long-tailed blues fly through your square, not from behind you, but from left to right, let's say, and then a bit later, another long-tailed blue goes through the square, let's say again, left to right, you say, well, it's another one. I've got no reason to assume it's one of the first 2, because butterflies don't necessarily fly ahead of you and then come back towards you. You sometimes see that, but white admiral can do that. White admiral can deliberately go up and down a footpath or the edge of a wood. But if you notice that, you don't count it more than once. So you count them each time you see them, basically, the butterflies, unless they've come from behind you. Okay, cool. That's given someone time to ask a question if they were going to. So shall I plough on?
Someone's just typing. Hang on a second.
All right.
There was another one about how do you measure the wind? Because that's a very much a beginner volunteer. But I've said that I can provide extra documents on that because you can't see the table.
Well, everyone who comes Saturday will be given that.
Exactly.
And other people will find it on the website.
I've got.
It's just a matter of most people, when I go out and ask people, what do you think the wind strength is? It's very rare for people to differ by more than 1, which is to say, if somebody says, I think the wind strength today is 4, other people might say 3. But you don't, in my experience, have people say it's 4 and somebody else says, no, it's only 2. That sort of difference doesn't occur. And the descriptions are really quite straightforward. Yeah. You know, if the trees are shaking about like mad and you think that branches might come off, then it's too windy to go out. If there's the very slightest movement in the top of a few bushes, it's probably a 3. If there's just the odd leaf flicking around here and there, it's probably a 2. If there's virtually no wind but you can feel it, it's a 1. It's something you pick up from being out there in the field, and in just the same way I expect most of us can walk outside and say, oh, it feels like it's about 15 today, or 22, whatever it is. You get the same with the wind, but you do get written instructions as well on the website.
Yeah, and I will share all those later with my volunteers. Thank you, and thank you. That's brilliant.
Well, we haven't quite finished, I'm afraid.
Right, I'll shut up now.
Okay, so some of the Transect teams would like some new volunteers, and we have a coordinator of Transects called Mark Chapman. If you're listening in and you're one of the BBAT people, then obviously Colin Williams is the man to go to, but Mark and Colin talk to each other a lot because we try and help BBAT with their Transect team allocation, and they do the same for us. And I've just noticed I meant to change that because I've got a spelling mistake. Oh, dreadful. Right, so anyway, there are some Transects which might like some help. They exist already. They're not ones that have just been set up, but for one reason or another, sometimes people have to reduce the input. So we might need some help around Maidenhead Thicket, Wildmoor Heath, which is a good site to go to if you want to see some rare heathland butterflies, and Miriam's Cross and Bradfield. It's possible there are others in Berkshire that are calling out for help as well, because we haven't had responses yet from all the Transect team leaders. In Buckinghamshire, up around Milton Keynes, there's still some bits to fill in up there, I think. Is that right, Carly? You could do with a few more people? while Carla's thinking about coming off mute.
Sorry, I started talking and I forgot to turn my camera on.
Okay.
Yes, we are thinking of starting a new transect as well up in Great Linford Manor. And yes, we've had a few people sort of leave the area. So yeah, How Park Wood, Tatton Hoe.
Okay, thank you. And Oxfordshire
with new volunteers.
Oxfordshire that's fine. Oxfordshire is a strange place because long while back now, and I'm talking 25 years ago, a whole load of very enthusiastic people set up lots of transects, and because that was 25 years ago, they're getting, I think they would probably allow me to say this about them, a bit unstable. You know, I don't mean they're mentally unstable, I mean they tend to wobble about a bit when they walk now, and on uneven ground it's not really safe. So they're gradually removing themselves. So there's quite a few you can see here where we think we might need some help. In addition, I bet there are places that aren't on this map of sites that could do with some help. So if you're at all interested in joining an existing Transect team, get in touch. The vacant WCBS squares, the ones which are allocated randomly, are in Oxfordshire, they're the green squares, look. And then a couple here, 3 there. In Bucks, they're the purple squares. There's a lot for some reason in Bucks, mostly up in the north. And in Berkshire, there's just 2 that aren't allocated down here. So if you fancy any of those, the person to get in touch with is called Peter Philp. It's all on the Upper Thames branch website. I mean, the beauty of walking a WCBS square is that this data, in my opinion, is incredibly valuable, because people tend to set up transects where they know they're going to get a good walk and see lots of interesting things, which skews the data. And when we report back to the government that people out on their transect walks saw loads of small pearl border fritillaries and they could hardly move for the Adonis blue and Lulworth skippers, the government say, oh, we're doing a good job, aren't we? And I'm not sure that they are. So the WCBS squares being selected randomly, they might be in a shopping centre car park, and they might be in the middle of a ploughed arable field. And that's the beauty of them. They redress the balance, because people didn't choose to walk these places. And that's why some of these, look up here, are not adopted, because they're probably really boring places to walk, where even in the summer you might only see 3 butterflies. But they are very, very valuable, because they paint a much fairer picture about what's going on in the real countryside and not just on nature reserves. Here's a list of the vacant ones. So we've got Carter's Hill, which is Sindlesham, and California Country Park. We've got Goddington, which I'm afraid I've never heard of, but I've heard of Twyford, and Padbury, Oving Whitchurch, Bletchley, Milton Keynes, a couple there, Sheddington, one near Tring. That's a new one, just been created. I'm not quite sure why that one's been given to us. I think it's because they got rid of one from a place called Aston Clinton, which isn't very far away. It was impossible to walk, the road was too dangerous. Gerrard's Cross, there's one down there. Again, that one's actually a bit difficult to walk because the road is a dangerous road along part of it. Carterton, 2 near Carterton, but they're actually some distance apart. It's just that Carterton's the nearest big village. Shipton under Wychwood, Banbury and Bicester. So those are all the WCBS bits. And now I'm going to honestly very quickly go through recording the results. So I know you've been listening and you're probably thinking that your brain needs a rest, but we are very nearly finished. So whether you do a transect or a WCBS walk, you'll have to register with the UK BMS. And once you're registered and you go to put your data entry in after you've finished your walk, the end of a successful walk round, you've got your data, you're keen to enter it. This is the screen you will see. You can see this one is for the WCBS, but the one for Transect looks really similar. And you just fill in what you've seen. Each one of your data entries will look something like this. You've already filled in the bit about whether it was 14 degrees C and a boat at wind scale of 3 from the south or whatever it was. You fill all that data and then you get, then you get to this page where you can just tick off the numbers that you've seen in each of the sections. So it's pretty straightforward. And then you obviously just click send, and that's your data sent in. And once you've done that, it's logged forever in the National Database of Records. You'll notice here that you can record butterflies that you've seen on your route, moths, odonata, and others. So you can say, for instance, well, I'm really good at birds, I might as well include them. You're allowed to record all sorts of different things, but they're most interested in butterflies, then moths, and then odonata. That's why those three are there. And when you click on these, I can't do it here because this is just a picture of the screen. But if this was live and you click on the word moths, it would populate this with moths which are known at that site, or it will give you all the moths that are seen in the county where you are, and you can then narrow it down. You'll see it says here, look, butterflies known at this site, or common in that county. So if you were in the north of Scotland, it might give you species under common that it wouldn't in the south of England. Okay, so I think that's pretty straightforward. The only issue with it is that it can be very slow because surprising number of people, and I mean thousands of people, all try to use it to put their data in at the same time in the evening after they've done their walk. So it can be very slow at times. Reduced effort surveys, just very quickly to mention that it may be you like the idea of standardized surveys because you can see that it's good science, but you're not sure you've got the ability to volunteer yourself for doing something as time consuming as a transect or even a WCBS walk. So you might be able to help with single species surveys where, generally speaking, for a species which is very scarce and about which we want to know as much as we can, you go out and study a life stage. So it might be, for instance, like quite a few people, that you'd go out and use a similar technique to that which we've talked about. You'd have a fixed route, you'd walk for a fixed amount of time at certain times of the year suitable to that life stage, and you'd record what you see. So here there are people who go out and do regular fixed counts of brown hair streak eggs, and they compare their results year on year for the sites, and they think about why the numbers go up and down. They might do it, and this has been a bit upset recently by COVID, but they might do it for black hair streak pupa. So this year there is a walk to show people how to find black hair streak pupa, and I know that a university student has just done a single species study on black hair streak where he discovered that the larvae fluoresce under UV lights at night. So that might be your chosen way to spend your nights. I don't think many of us will be walking around in blackthorn in the dark because it's a bit prickly even in the daytime.
So Nick, this is something that I wanted to have a look at in Milton Keynes to try and find the rare black hair streak, and wanted to perhaps concentrate on some hair streak surveys, but I know we're a bit far off that. So I'd be interested to know when that...
But we can talk about it on Saturday, Carla.
Sure, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Wood white, and just a bit north of Milton Keynes, we have still got wood whites, and it's one of the rarest butterflies in the country. We're really keen to get a few more surveyors. We've got quite a few landowners with private woodlands up there that don't necessarily like people coming in. Their gamekeepers might get a bit feisty with you if they find you in there without permission. But we have got permission for what you might call certified surveyors. So if you fancy going to look for wood white on a regular basis and using a standardized technique, not just going for a walk with your camera, then we'd be very happy to hear from you. And then, as I said at the beginning, everything goes through into all the data that helps both the UK and European governments determine their policies. So I think it's really worthwhile. The fact that I went to a meeting where, to my amazement, they told us how they changed government policy because of some of the data that came through from the UK BMS and the way that agri-environmental schemes were being administered. One of the things they were paying farmers to do, our data showed it wasn't really having any effect, whereas some of the information that farmers were being asked to employ with regard to hedge management was having an effect. So they switched the money to fund the hedge management more than the other thing, which was to do with the amount of space they were leaving around ditches, I think. I forget precisely what it was. But anyway, they actually tailor these. They do read the data. They do use it to make their schemes better, which is very encouraging. And then I'm just going to go very, very quickly through one more thing, which is people will have heard me say, even if something really rare flies past just outside your box, or something flies from behind you, you're not supposed to record it. And you'll be thinking, well, that's crazy. If I've seen something rare, I should record it. Yes, just not on the walk data. So there are other ways to record things. I've forgotten that I've got a slide here. This is showing people a couple of years back on the training walk. So just to tell you that what we'll do is give you a printed Transect recorder sheet, get you along, and you'll actually be spotting coloured pegs which will be put out, and it's your ability to spot them, but more importantly, your ability to decide would they be within the 5-metre box. And then we go back and discuss, because when you actually walk one of these things, it's so much easier to learn the technique than it is listening to me on an evening's natter like this. That's where we're going. Cow Park Wood, just there to the southwest of Milton Keynes. And there's a cafe next door as well. Next door to, literally next door, the same building that we're going to be in. But we've now got to the bit where I was saying, so if you do see something that you couldn't record on the official recording, you could literally just make a note of it and send a written report to somebody. But that's not the way we do things these days very often, is it? So what you do is you download something called iRecord Butterflies, which is a free phone app, onto your phone. And then you use this by either pressing record once and letting go, and it pops up so that you can record a single thing that you saw outside your transect walk. Or maybe this has happened that as you've walked along, you've seen several things that you thought you should record. You can't record them on the transect or the WCBS because they were outside the box or they came from behind you, but you think you should record them. So then you, if I can get my mouse to play ball, here we are, you hold the record for a long time and up pops a different thing which allows you to write a list. So for one location on a particular date, it will let you add a list of species. So the iRecord Butterfly app is superb in my opinion. If you're a bit unsure of your identifications, it's got some really good pictures. For each species, you can go into a background about when they fly, where you're likely to see them, what sort of aberrations there might be if you think you've seen one that looks a bit odd that would explain that. So that's really good. Definitely advise you to put this on your phone and take it with you when you go out recording, and recording everything you see within your box, within the rules, the protocols of the scheme, and things that you see outside the scheme can be stuck into this. And then it all gets captured and used later. And I think we're going to say that's it, except to mention you can do the same for moths, and there's information about that here. It's not at the same, unfortunately, not at the same level yet. I don't think there is an iRecord for moths specifically, but if you download iRecord, which is the parent, so to speak, of iRecord Butterflies, you can choose to record moths as a subset. But I'm not going to get into all that because it starts to get very complicated. Right now, what I want to do, and of course I can't see a way to do it, is stop sharing. Where's that gone? Is it here somewhere?
That's it.
Has it gone? I can still see it on my screen, but I'm not sure.
No, it's gone now.